She came back only to sell the land. The man she'd left behind was still waiting at the gate. I've kept records in Harrow Basin for 31 years, deeds and titles, liens and conveyances, every parcel of ground that changed hands in this part of New Mexico territory. And I will tell you plainly that the most consequential transaction I ever witnessed was not the Alvarado land grant that settled 3 years of litigation, nor the Breckenridge right-of-way that ran the railroad spur through the eastern flats. It was 1,100 acres of dust and juniper scrub out on the Crane parcel, and it mattered not one lick what was written in the deed at the end of it. What mattered was the woman who came back to sell it, and the man who had been waiting at the gate. My name is Cobb Mayhew, and I was there for the whole of it. Delia Crane, she was Delia Whitmore before she married Porter Crane and left this country, rode into Harrow Basin on the second Tuesday of October with a carpetbag, a letter from a Tucson law firm, and the particular kind of face a person gets when they have decided everything in advance. She had decided she would be in and out inside 2 weeks. She had decided she would not be moved by the smell of the sage after rain or the way the light sits on the Sangre de Cristos at dusk, orange and then blood red and then gone, the way she used to describe it to me when we were young and she still lived here. She had decided, above all, that she would conduct this business as business and nothing more. She was wrong on every count, but she came in looking very certain. I saw her through the window of the deed office when she tied her horse at the rail. She was 51 years old, and she looked at the way a well-made rifle looks its age, no apology in it, no softening either. The dark hair had gone iron gray at the temples, cut plain and pinned up without fuss. She wore a brown wool traveling coat and boots that had seen real miles, and she carried herself like a woman who had learned the cost of every step and had decided not to waste any. I stepped out onto the boardwalk, and she stopped when she saw me. "Cobb Mayhew," she said. "Delia Whitmore," I said. "Crane," she said. "Not any more," I said, because I had the letter from the Tucson firm and I knew Porter Crane had been dead 8 months. She took that without flinching, which told me everything I needed to know about the marriage. "No," she said, "not any more," and she came inside. We sat at the deed table and I spread the Crane parcel survey across it, 1,114 acres, give or take, running from the eastern edge of Coyote Creek up through the juniper breaks to the ridge Harrow Basin people call the Caprock. Good grass in the creek bottom, thin and rocky up top, a dependable spring on the north face of the ridge. Porter Crane's father had homesteaded it, Porter had inherited it, and Porter had never once set foot in New Mexico in his life. He had taken the deed as a line in a will and left it to sit. Now it was Delia's to dispose of. "One buyer," I told her, "one man in this basin with both the capital and the interest." She didn't ask the name, she already knew. "He's put in a fair offer," I said. "I had it in writing on the desk between us." She looked at it, she did not touch it. "How long has the offer been standing?" "He filed it with me 6 months ago," I said, "the day after the Tucson letter arrived saying you'd inherited the parcel." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I see." I thought she was going to say something more, but she only picked up the offer sheet, folded it once, and put it in the pocket of her coat. "Tell him I'll want to ride the boundary before I sign," she said. "I want to know what I'm selling." I sent word that afternoon to Emmett Lusk. Emmett Lusk had run cattle on Lusk Creek land for going on 30 years. His father had built the main house, a long adobe with deep portal shade, and a wood floor that Emmett had laid himself plank by plank, and Emmett had added the barn and the bunkhouse and the stone cistern and the windmill. And after all of that, he had sat down and looked at what he had built and found it to be a good thing. And then he had gone on building anyway, because a man like Emmett Lusk does not know how to stop improving his ground. He ran 600 head, kept 5 hands, and produced the best-tempered horses in the basin, which was a thing he did not advertise but which every rancher in 3 counties knew. He had never married. I want to be careful about how I say what I know, Because what I know partly from having watched and partly from things Emmett said to me over the years in the way. A quiet man will sometimes speak more truth to a friend than he means to. I know that when he was 34 years old, he had courted Delia Whitmore with the steadiness that characterized everything he did, not with grand words or grand gestures, but with the reliability of a man who shows up when he says he will and does not say things he cannot back with action. And I know that Delia had liked him a great deal, maybe more than she had words for, but that she had also been 28 and restless and half persuaded by a life in Tucson, and by the attentions of Porter Crane, who had money and ambition, and the kind of surface shine that a restless woman sometimes mistakes for depth. She had made her choice. She had married Porter Crane and gone to Tucson, and Emmett Lusk had stood at the depot and watched the stage carry her away, and he had not watched another woman go or tried to bring another woman in. He had ranched and read and worked his ground and sat on his portal in the evenings and looked out at the Caprock, which happened to be the northern edge of the land he was now trying to buy. I do not know if he had kept a candle lit, exactly. I know he had not blown it out. He came to the deed office the next morning while the air still had frost in it, and he sat across from me, and I studied his face for whatever I could find there. He was 56, Emmett, broad through the shoulder and lean everywhere else, with the kind of hands that had split enough wood and pulled enough wire to look like tools themselves. He had gone mostly gray but worn it well, and the creases at the corners of his eyes were the kind you get from squinting into the sun, and from smiling when something genuinely warranted it, which in Emmett's case was not often but was real when it happened. "She wants to ride the Boundary," I told him. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning, if that suits." "It suits," he said. He started to rise and I said, "Emmett." He sat back down. I chose my words. "She came back to finish business," I said. "Close it up and go home, that's her intention." He looked at me across the desk. He had a way of listening to hard things that made you feel you hadn't said anything he hadn't already accounted for. "I know her intention," he said. Then he stood and put on his hat and walked out into the morning. They rode the Boundary line the following day, a Thursday, starting at the Coyote Creek corner post at first light. I did not ride with them. This was not my business to attend, and I had deed filings that morning besides. But I had it from two sources. From Prue Gallegos, who ran the feed store and whose husband Tomas was out mending wire in the east pasture that day and saw them cross the creek bottom, and from Delia herself, who came to see me that evening. Tomas said they rode side by side without much conversation that he could see, which surprised him because he expected that if Delia Whitmore had come back to Harrow Basin after 17 years, there would be a quantity of words deployed. He said they crossed the creek in the shallows and rode up into the juniper breaks at a steady walk, Emmett pointing occasionally to landmarks, a post, a rock cairn, a twisted cedar that had served as a corner marker since before either of them was born. He said that after a time Delia rode out ahead on a long flat stretch and put her horse to a lope, and Emmett let her go and came along behind at his own pace, and that there was something in the way he watched her ride that Tomas said he did not have quite the words for, but that he filed away as worth remembering. Delia came to the deed office at 4 that afternoon, still in her riding clothes, and she sat down in the same chair she'd taken the day before and put her hat on the table and looked at me. "It's good land," she said. "Better than fair," I agreed. "The spring on the north face is still running." "It always does," I said. "Emmett checks it." She was quiet. Then she said, "He's put in fence posts along the Caprock line." "He has," I said. "He's been running some cattle up into the ridge grass in summer, had an agreement with Porter's estate for the grazing rights, informal-like. He's been a good neighbor to land that didn't have any neighbors." She heard something in that, I think, because she looked at the window a moment. "He take a meal up there?" she asked. I must have looked at her oddly because she said, "There was a tin cup hanging on the gate post at the spring. It was clean. "That be Emmett," I said. She smoothed the front of her coat. "I'll need another day or two," she said, "to think it through." "Take the time you need," I said. "The offer won't move." She stood and picked up her hat. "No," she said slowly, "I don't expect it will." But what happened on the second day I know better, because I was there for the end of it. They had arranged to meet at the North Spring to look at the fence line Emmett had run along the Caprock Ridge, and I had gone up that afternoon with the deed paperwork and the survey map in my saddlebag, because Delia had sent word she thought she'd be ready to proceed. I came up the ridge trail as the sun was dropping west, and the shadow of the caprock was stretching long across the grass, and I heard their voices before I saw them. Not arguing, not the sound of two people concluding business either. I came around the last stand of juniper to the clearing at the spring, and I saw them standing by the gate, not the gate itself, which was just a cedar post affair Emmett had put in, simple and solid the way he built everything, but in the open ground just beyond it, where the grass was good, and the view ran south across the whole of Harrow Basin, town and all, the way it would look to someone who had been away for a long time and was seeing it fresh. They were standing close together, not touching. Emmett had his hat in his hands, which was a thing I had seen him do perhaps 4 times in 30 years of knowing him. Delia had her arms crossed, not in the manner of defiance, but the way a person holds themselves when they are trying to keep something from spilling out. I stopped my horse at the edge of the clearing and did not announce myself, because whatever was being said was none of my business and the paperwork could wait. I caught the tail end of it. I caught enough. Delia said, in a voice I had to strain to hear, "I was going to leave again tomorrow." Emmett said, "I know. I had my mind made up when I rode in." "I know that too," Emmett said. She looked out at the basin. "You never said anything," she said. 17 years, you never sent a letter, never came to Tucson." "You weren't mine to come after," Emmett said. "You made a choice and I respected it." Delia turned to look at him at that. She had the expression of a woman who has just heard a thing she had always suspected was true, but had gone 17 years without confirmation of. "And now," she said. Emmett put his hat back on his head and looked at her steadily in the manner that was simply his way, and that I had always privately thought was one of the finest things about him. "Now you're a free woman," he said, "selling land she doesn't have to sell, and I've got a gate post here that's had a cup hanging on it for 17 years in case anybody stopped by thirsty." A pause. "You can go if you want to go, Delia. I've never once tried to hold you." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "What if I'm done going?" Emmett did not say anything to that. He reached out and opened the cedar gate for her, and she walked through it, and he closed it behind her, and they stood together on the other side of it in the long evening shadow of the caprock, not speaking, and I turned my horse around as quietly as I could manage and rode back down the ridge trail with the deed papers still in my saddlebag, and a smile I did not bother hiding. Let me go back, because the story deserves its full accounting, and I have not done justice to the days between the first boundary ride and the evening at the gate. I have given you the shell of it, but the meat of a thing is in the particulars, and I was watching close enough to know the particulars. The second morning, the Friday, Emmett and Delia had arranged to ride the creek bottom, which was the most productive stretch of the parcel, and the piece she would most need to understand if she was going to sign off on a price. Emmett came to the Drover's Rest, where Delia was lodging at first light, which was his habitual hour for beginning anything. He did not knock. He tied his horse at the rail and sat on the bench outside and waited. Delia told me later that she looked out her window and saw him sitting there in the cold morning, hat pulled down, gloved hands folded in his lap, patient as a cedar post. She said he wasn't waiting to be noticed. He wasn't performing anything. He just sat there because he said he would be there, and he was. She got her boots on and came out, and they rode the creek bottom as planned. The grass in the bottom was good. knee-high on a horse in the bends where the water came closest, and there was a stand of cottonwoods at the north end that had grown considerable since Delia had last seen them, 20 or 30 feet now, with trunks going silver-gray. "My father planted those," she said. "Your grandfather," Emmett said. She looked at him. "Your grandfather homesteaded this parcel," he said. "Your father was born here, it's in the old records. Cobb has them." She was quiet a long time after that. They sat their horses in the shade of the cottonwoods, and the creek ran past, low this time of year, talking over the stones the way a creek does, and Delia looked at those trees the way a person looks at something that connects them to a longer line than they had remembered they were part of. "Porter never told me that," she said finally. "Porter never came here," Emmett said. "It was not said unkindly, it was simply a fact." "No," she said, "he didn't." She reached out and put her hand on the rough bark of the nearest cottonwood, held it there a moment. Then she took her hand back and turned her horse south. "Let's finish the line," she said. They finished the line, and they came back to town in the early afternoon, and they ate at Prue Gallegos' brother's place, the only real eating establishment in Harrow Basin, a room with 6 tables and decent beans. And I had my noon meal there too, at a different table, and I watched them without appearing to. They talked. Delia asked questions about the Basin, who had died, who had come in, whether the Hendersons still ran that gray horse operation out on the eastern flats. They did not. They had sold and gone north to Colorado 6 years prior. Emmett answered each thing directly and without embellishment, which was his way with everything. He did not try to be interesting. He was simply honest, which turned out to be interesting enough. At one point Delia said something I didn't catch, and Emmett laughed. A short, real laugh, the kind that costs a quiet man something to give, and Delia looked at him with an expression I can only describe as startled, as if she had not expected him to have that in him, or had forgotten that he did. Afterward in the street they stood by their horses a moment before parting. Emmett said, "Same time tomorrow if you're still wanting to see the ridge." "I'll be there," she said. He nodded and put his foot in the stirrup and was up and gone, and Delia stood in the street, watching him ride toward the north end of town for a moment before she went inside. The Ridge Day was the Saturday, and I will tell you what I know of it because it matters. The North Ridge, the Caprock, as Basin people called it, was the high backbone of the Crane parcel, and from the top of it on a clear day you could see an unreasonable distance, the kind of distance that makes a person feel both very small and very rooted at once. It was hard going to get up there, a steep trail through the rocks and scrub, and it took the better part of the morning, and they did not get to the top until near noon. Emmett had a canvas sack with bread and dried meat and 2 oranges, which was a luxury in Harrow Basin, and he did not make anything of it, just handed it to her when she pulled up beside him at the top and looked south across the world. She ate and looked and did not say much for a while. Then she said, "I used to come up here when I was a girl. My father brought me." "I know," Emmett said. "You told me once, years ago." She glanced at him. "You remember that?" He shrugged one shoulder, the way a man does when he is understating something on purpose. "I remember most things you told me," he said. She looked back out at the Basin. Down below, the town of Harrow Basin was a small order of things: the feed store, the deed office, the church, the drover's rest, the handful of houses spread along the creek. From up here it looked self-contained and possible, the way a life looks when you are high enough above it to see its shape. "I was afraid," Delia said. Emmett didn't ask of what. He waited. "Not of you," she said, "of this." She moved her hand at the ridge, at the Basin, at all of it, the smallness of it. "I thought I wanted the big version, the city version. Porter had a house with 12 rooms. And," Emmett said. "And I learned what 12 rooms feel like when they're empty," she said, "which is big." He did not offer her sympathy, which she would not have wanted, and he did not offer her a better version of herself, which she did not need. He just sat beside her on the rimrock and looked south with her, and after a time she said, "I should have come back sooner." "You came back," he said. "I came back to sell," she said. "I know," Emmett said, "but you came back." The way he said it, not as an accusation, not as a reproof, just as a simple reckoning of the fact, made something in Delia's face change. I did not see this myself. She described it to me later in terms that did not do it justice, I think, because she was not a woman who had much practice describing the moment something inside her shifted. But she said it was like a stone in a lock turning, and she had not known until that moment that she had still been locked. They came down from the ridge in the late afternoon, and it was as they came through the last stand of junipers above the North Spring that they came to the gate, and that I arrived on my horse with the deed papers, and that I heard the end of what I have already told you. You know how it ended. I will tell you what came after. The following morning, Sunday, Delia came to the deed office before I opened it, and she knocked on the door until I answered it in my shirt sleeves with coffee in my hand. She had an expression I had not seen on her in all the days since she had arrived, and that I was not sure I had ever seen on her, because in the years before she left, she had always held herself at some small internal remove, a woman deciding whether a thing was worth trusting before she offered it anything. She had stopped deciding. "I'm not selling the parcel," she said. I looked at her. "All right," I said. "I want to make changes to the deed." She meant adding her name as active holder, clarifying the survey bounds, the business of a landowner settling in rather than cashing out. "And I'll need to know whether the territorial rules on the grazing agreement with Emmett's operation can be put into a proper written form." "They can," I said. "Good," she said, "do that." I moved aside to let her in. She sat at the deed table and I poured her a coffee, and we went through the paperwork with the morning light coming in the east window, and at one point she said, without looking up from the survey map, "He asked me to stay." "Did he?" I said. "In the way that Emmett Lusk asks anything," she said, "which is to say he opened a gate and waited to see whether I walked through it." "And you did," I said. "I've never been a fool," Delia said, which was not strictly accurate but was the kind of thing a woman can be forgiven for saying on a Sunday morning in the deed office after 17 years of being one. We finished the paperwork by noon, and I filed the deed amendments that afternoon, and by Monday the basin knew what they needed to know, which was that the Crane parcel was not going anywhere, and neither was Delia. The wedding was held in the church at the south end of Harrow Basin in the second week of November, 6 weeks after Delia had ridden in with her carpet bag and her Tucson law firm letter, and her face full of foregone conclusions. It was a small affair. Emmett did not do things for show, with Prue Gallegos' family taking up most of the pews and my wife and I, at the back, and old Father Morales presiding with the brisk competence of a man who has married off a considerable portion of a county over 40 years, and has found a rhythm. Emmett wore his good coat, which I had only seen him wear twice before, and he stood at the front with the stillness of a man who has come to a place he has been traveling toward for a very long time, and has no intention of hurrying now that he has arrived. Delia walked up the aisle in a blue wool dress that she had apparently had made in Tucson years ago, and never had occasion for, and when she came level with Emmett and they turned to face each other, I studied his face for whatever it might show. It showed, if you knew where to look, everything. He was a man who did not waste expression, but in that moment there was something in his eyes, not triumph, nothing so cheap as that, but a deep, plain satisfaction, the satisfaction of a thing that has been true for a long time being finally acknowledged out loud. As if the world had caught up with what he had known, and he was glad of it without needing to make a point of it. They exchanged their words in the quiet way of people who meant them, and Father Morales pronounced them, and that was that. I drove my wife home in the buckboard after, and it was one of those November evenings when the sky goes green at the horizon before the dark comes in, and the air was cold enough to see your breath but not so cold as to be disagreeable. And Lucinda leaned against my arm the way she has done for 28 years and said, "He waited a long time." "He did," I said. "Do you think he knew she'd come back?" I thought about that. The gate post and the tin cup. 6 months standing offer filed the day after the Tucson letter arrived. Fence posts along the Caprock line, put in clean. "I think he kept his ground ready," I said, "on the chance that she might." Lucinda was quiet a moment. Then she said she could have come back sooner. "She could," I agreed. "All those years." "Yes," I said. "Was it worth it? The waiting, I mean, for him." The buckboard horse was steady on the dark road, and the Sangre de Cristos were black shapes against the last of the sky, and somewhere out north the Crane parcel lay under the cold stars with the cottonwoods her grandfather had planted standing silver in the dark, and the spring on the north face running quiet and Emmett Lusk's cattle moving in the ridge grass. "Ask him," I said, "and he'd tell you it wasn't waiting." I had to think about how to put it right. "He was just living his life and keeping the door on the latch," I said. "A man can do both." Lucinda considered this. "And what about her?" she said. "Delia," I said. "She came back to sell and leave," Lucinda said. "What did she find?" I thought about that for a long time, all the way home in fact, and I did not answer until we pulled up at our own gate and I set the brake and she waited for me. "I think she found," I said, "that the thing she'd spent 17 years building a substitute for was still right here, intact, patient, available." I stepped down and held my hand up for her, and I think she found that the man who had it on offer was exactly the same man he'd always been, only more so. "More so," Lucinda said, taking my hand. "More himself," I said. "The way a thing gets when it's been cared for a long time." She squeezed my hand once and we went inside, and the light came on in the window, and out across the basin the dark had come down full and clean. I filed one last document the following spring, a land improvement record for the Crane parcel, showing a new structure erected on the south end of the creek bottom. A house, properly speaking, with a wood floor and a deep portal and a view south across all of Harrow Basin. The building permit had Emmett's name and Delia's name both on it, equally. I have seen the house since. It is a good house, built the way Emmett builds things, nothing wasted, nothing soft, every board where it belongs. Delia has a kitchen garden going on the east side, which produces better than any garden in the basin, and she has put up curtains in the windows, yellow ones, which you would not have guessed at if you knew only the woman who arrived in October with her coat buttoned and her mind made up. Emmett is the same as he always was. He works the same hours, keeps the same cattle, rides his ground in the same steady way, and at the end of each day he comes home to that house, and I think he considers it a remarkable and improbable thing, and I think he is right too. Delia told me once, not long after the wedding, that she had ridden up to the ridge on her own one afternoon, just to see it again in the winter light. "The cup was still on the gate post," she said, with a dry look. "He'd have kept it there forever," I said. "I know," she said, and she said it the way you say a thing that has moved from the category of loss into the category of gift, slowly, because the reclassification takes time, but arriving at last and arriving for good. That is the story of the Crane parcel. 1,114 acres of New Mexico high desert, a spring on the north face, a stand of cottonwoods planted by a man long dead, and a gate on the Caprock Ridge with a tin cup on the post. The acreage didn't change hands, but the woman who came to sell it came home, and the man at the gate was still there. That was always going to be the transaction that counted.